13 Worst Secret Offspring of Hollywood's Forbidden Affairs. Hollywood's golden age looked perfect from the outside. Flawless stars, dream romances, and carefully polished family images that the public adored. But behind the photo shoots and studio-crafted smiles, there was a secret world built on cover-ups, lies, and children whose very existence threatened billion-dollar careers. Some of these kids were hidden in plain sight. Others were denied for decades. A few grew up believing entire stories about their origins, stories designed not to protect them, but to protect the adults who created them, and the lengths Hollywood went to keep these secrets buried. Sometimes shocking, sometimes cruel, and sometimes heartbreaking. What you're about to hear isn't the Hollywood you've seen in the movies. This is the side the studios never wanted the world to know. Real children, real lives, and real consequences from forbidden affairs that rewrote the rules of fame itself. And the first story shows just how far the industry was willing to go to erase a child from history. Judy Lewis, the daughter Hollywood tried to erase. Judy Lewis was born into one of Hollywood's most elaborate secrets, a child hidden not from the public, but from herself. Her mother, Loretta Young, was the industry's wholesome Catholic star. Her father, Clark Gable, was married, and at the peak of his fame. Their affair during the Call of the Wild wasn't just risky, it was career-ending if discovered. To protect both reputations, Young quietly disappeared, carried the pregnancy in private, and returned with a manufactured story. She was adopting a little girl named Judy. In reality, she was taking back her own biological daughter under a new identity, crafted to fool the world. Hollywood insiders recognized the resemblance instantly, especially Judy's ears, which matched Gable's signature look. Instead of acknowledging the truth, Young approved surgery to pin them back, not for medical reasons, but to erase the evidence. Judy grew up sensing something was wrong, surrounded by people who all knew the secret except her. She finally learned the truth in her 30s, not from her mother, but from a magazine article exposing the long-rumored connection. Loretta eventually admitted it, while Gable had already passed away, never acknowledging the daughter Hollywood worked so hard to hide. Ingrid Bergman's love child that outraged America. Ingrid Bergman wasn't just admired, she was America's symbol of purity. That's why her secret affair with Italian director Roberto Rossellini became one of Hollywood's most explosive scandals. While still married, Bergman traveled to Italy to film Stromboli. By the end of production, she was pregnant, and the father wasn't her husband. When the truth surfaced, the reaction was unlike anything a movie star had ever faced. America turned on her overnight. Newspapers condemned, her churches spoke out. And in a moment that still feels surreal today, a U.S. senator stood on the Senate floor and declared Bergman a powerful influence for evil. Her unborn child became the center of a nationwide moral panic. Studios cut ties. Theaters banned her films. The woman once celebrated for roles in Casablanca and Gaslight was suddenly a public villain. Bergman gave birth to her son, Robertino, in the middle of this backlash. His arrival marked the end of her Hollywood career, at least temporarily. She married Rossellini, had twins with him, and stayed in Europe until attitudes softened years later. Her child didn't just come from a forbidden affair. He became the symbol of a scandal that nearly erased one of Hollywood's most beloved stars. Lana Turner's daughter and the mobster killing. Lana Turner was Hollywood royalty, glamorous, adored, and carefully crafted into the perfect screen goddess. But behind that polished image was a turbulent relationship with mob enforcer Johnny Stompanato, a man known for possessiveness, jealousy, and explosive temper. Their arguments were constant and intense, creating a frightening environment for the one person who witnessed it all. Lana's 14-year-old daughter, Cheryl Crane. In 1958, one of those confrontations spiraled out of control. A heated argument erupted in Lana's bedroom, with Stompanato shouting and advancing toward her as Cheryl watched from the hallway. Fearing her mother was in serious danger, Cheryl grabbed the closest object she could find to protect her. Moments later, the confrontation ended abruptly, and Stompanato was fatally wounded. The court ruled Cheryl's action as justifiable, acknowledging the fear and chaos that had unfolded inside the home. Hollywood was stunned. A teenager caught in the middle of a violent relationship was not the image anyone expected from one of its brightest stars. Rumors spread for years, some even claiming Lana had been involved and Cheryl took the blame. Nothing ever confirmed those whispers, but they lingered long after the incident. Cheryl spent years dealing with trauma, public scrutiny, and the emotional weight of that night. Her childhood ended instantly, becoming one of Hollywood's darkest and most complicated chapters. Patty Duke's baby daddy mystery. Patty Duke was just 17 when she found herself at the center of one of Hollywood's most confusing paternity storms, a situation so tangled even she wasn't sure who the father was. At the time, Duke was battling untreated bipolar disorder, caught in a whirlwind of relationships and impulsive decisions that would complicate her life for decades. During this chaotic period, she secretly dated Desi Arnaz Jr., the son of Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz. Their romance was brief, dramatic, and heavily disapproved of by his powerful family. At the same time, Duke had become involved with another man, actor John Astin. And then, in a moment she later couldn't fully explain, she married a complete stranger named Michael Tell, a man who was subletting her apartment. The marriage lasted just 13 days. When Duke gave birth to her son, Sean, the speculation exploded. Was his father Desi Jr.? Was it Astin? Or was it the man she'd married for less than 2 weeks? For years, even Duke didn't know the answer. John Astin eventually adopted Sean, and the rumors faded, until DNA testing decades later revealed the truth. Michael Tell, the stranger she barely knew, was the biological father Sean grew up with 3 father figures, an origin story as complicated as Hollywood itself. Errol Flynn's alleged underage daughter. Errol Flynn built his fame playing swashbucklers, handsome, daring heroes who won every fight and every woman off screen, though his personal life carried a far darker reputation. In the early 1940s, Flynn was charged with statutory assault involving 2 girls who were legally considered minors, a trial that became one of the era's most sensational scandals. He was eventually acquitted, but the courtroom drama exposed a pattern of behavior that would haunt his legacy forever. Behind the headlines, whispers spread about other teenage girls who had been involved with Flynn. Among the most unsettling claims was a story from a young woman who later said she had given birth to his child. According to her account, she was underage at the time, and the studio machinery moved quickly to silence anything that could spark another legal disaster. She reportedly raised her daughter quietly, never pushing the claim publicly, knowing the consequences would be explosive. Flynn never acknowledged this child, and no documentation has ever confirmed the allegation, but the rumor persisted for decades, resurfacing whenever his darker history was revisited. If true, it represents one of Hollywood's most troubling secret offspring, concealed not for image alone, but to bury a situation that could have destroyed a star's career and possibly exposed a crime. Clark Gable's posthumous son, born after Hollywood's king died. When Clark Gable died in 1960, reporters flooded the hospital, fans mourned, and Hollywood declared the end of an era. But what most people didn't know was that Gable had left behind one final chapter, still unborn. His 5th wife, Kay Spreckles, was quietly pregnant at the time of his death, carrying a child who would enter the world 4 months later without ever meeting the father everyone else idolized. John Clark Gable was born into a legacy he didn't choose. From birth, he was surrounded by the image of a man he would only know through movie posters, fan magazines, and the expectations of people who saw him as Hollywood royalty. Growing up meant constantly being compared to a father who wasn't just famous, he was a legend. Unlike Gable's secret daughter, Judy Lewis, John's existence wasn't hidden or denied, but the absence was still profound. He inherited a name recognized everywhere, yet no memories, no stories shared by the father himself, and no personal connection to the man the world called the King of Hollywood. His life became a shadow of someone he never met, shaped not by a relationship, but by the myth of a father who lived on only in film. Eddie Fisher's estranged son. The child left behind. Eddie Fisher had one of the most famous voices of his generation, a crooner adored by millions. But while the public saw charm and romance, his own children saw someone far different, a father who drifted in and out of their lives as easily as he drifted between marriages. When he left Debbie Reynolds for her close friend Elizabeth Taylor, it wasn't just a Hollywood scandal. It was the moment his family fractured for good. Carrie Fisher and her brother Todd were still young when their father walked out. The tabloids turned the breakup into a circus, painting Eddie as the heartbroken lover swept away by Taylor's glamour. Behind the headlines, the fallout hit his children hardest. They rarely saw him. Phone calls were inconsistent. Visits were awkward, brief, and sometimes forgotten altogether. Todd Fisher has spoken openly about what that felt like, watching his father's face on album covers while barely knowing the man himself. Carrie, later famous for Star Wars and her razor-sharp wit, wrote about the emotional distance in her books, describing a father who seemed more like a guest star than a parent. Eddie Fisher didn't hide his children. He simply left them behind, creating a different kind of Hollywood secret, one where the absence was the wound. Joan Crawford's adopted children, PR or parenthood. Joan Crawford had everything: fame, money, and a reputation built on discipline and glamour. But when she began adopting children, Hollywood applauded her as the modern working mother who could balance stardom with family life. Behind that polished image, though, were rumors that her adoptions were driven less by maternal instinct and more by the need to craft a perfect public persona. Crawford adopted 4 children: Christina, Christopher, and the twins, Kathy and Cindy. Each arrival generated glowing media coverage that painted her as a devoted, selfless parent. But years later, Christina, her oldest daughter, shattered that illusion in her memoir, Mommy Dearest. She accused Crawford of emotional cruelty, strict punishments, and violent outbursts. The book ignited a national controversy, turning Crawford from Hollywood icon to one of the industry's most infamous mothers. There were other unsettling claims, too. Christina insisted that some of the adoptions weren't done through standard agencies, but through questionable intermediaries, arrangements that looked more like PR moves than family building. While the twins later defended Crawford and said their childhoods were loving, the conflicting stories left the public unsure what to believe. What remains clear is this: Joan Crawford's children weren't hidden, but they may have been used, shaped into props for a public image she couldn't afford to lose. Marlon Brando's Hidden Children and Family Chaos. Marlon Brando changed acting forever, but his personal life was far less controlled than his performances. Behind the brilliance was a maze of relationships, affairs, and children. Some acknowledged, some denied, and some who surfaced only after his death. Brando fathered at least 11 children, though many believe the real number is higher. His approach to parenthood shifted constantly, leaving some kids deeply connected to him while others grew up as strangers. The instability inside the Brando family became tragically public. His son, Christian, was convicted of killing his sister. Cheyenne's boyfriend, a case that exposed years of dysfunction. Cheyenne herself suffered severe mental health struggles and later took her own life, adding to the family's devastating history. These weren't isolated tragedies. They were part of a larger pattern of emotional chaos that followed Brando's children throughout their lives. After Brando died, more individuals came forward claiming he was their father, revealing how many secrets he kept outside the spotlight. Some were raised believing rumors, others grew up unaware of his involvement entirely. For many of them, Brando wasn't the legendary figure audiences adored. He was a myth, distant, unpredictable, and missing during the moments that mattered most. Bobby Darin, the sister who was really his mother. Bobby Darin rose to fame with hits like Mac the Knife, but behind the swagger and showmanship was a secret that shattered his identity. Growing up, Darin believed his mother was a tough, outspoken woman named Polly, and that his older sister Nina was simply another member of their busy household. What he didn't know was that his entire childhood story had been carefully rewritten. Nina wasn't his sister at all. She was his real mother. As a pregnant teenager in the 1930s, she faced enormous stigma. To protect her and the baby, the family agreed to present Polly, the grandmother, as Bobby's mother instead. It was a lie meant to shield him, but it created a fragile foundation that eventually collapsed. Darin learned the truth as an adult, and the revelation hit him harder than any career setback. Everything he believed about his origins, every family memory, suddenly felt like part of a long-running performance. Friends said he became obsessed with understanding who he truly was, turning inward and questioning the life he had built. The discovery shifted his music, his politics, and his sense of self in ways he never fully resolved. For Darin, the secret wasn't about Hollywood, it was about family. And the truth arrived too late for him to find peace. Charlie Chaplin's court-declared daughter he denied. Charlie Chaplin built an empire on laughter, but one scandal nearly destroyed everything he'd achieved. In the 1940s, actress Joan Barry claimed Chaplin was the father of her daughter, Carol Ann. Chaplin denied it immediately, insisting their brief involvement had ended long before the child was conceived. What followed became one of Hollywood's most notorious courtroom battles. At the time, blood tests were a new scientific tool, and the results in this case were clear. The test showed Chaplin was not the father, but California law didn't recognize blood tests as definitive evidence. So, even with science on his side, Chaplin walked into a courtroom where public opinion mattered more than biology. The jury ruled against him, legally naming him the father and forcing him to pay child support. The verdict was a disaster. Chaplin's relationships with younger women were already controversial, and the trial amplified every criticism newspapers tore into him. Politicians condemned him. His image shifted from beloved comedian to suspicious figure overnight. Carol Ann grew up with the world believing Chaplin was her father, while the man at the center of it refused to acknowledge her. It was a paternity scandal where science lost, reputation shattered, and a child became the symbol of a battle she never asked for. Frank Sinatra Jr., kidnapped and forever in the shadow. Frank Sinatra Jr. was born with a name the whole world recognized, but that recognition came with a price. At 19, while performing at a hotel near Lake Tahoe, he was abducted by 3 men who tied him up, blindfolded him, and held him for ransom. The kidnapping dominated national headlines, and his father paid $240,000 to bring him home safely. The kidnappers were caught and convicted, but the public fascination never faded. Almost immediately, conspiracy theories appeared. Some people insisted the kidnapping was staged to boost Frank Jr.'s early singing career, even though the FBI found no evidence of that. The rumors followed him for years, overshadowing his actual talent and turning a traumatic event into a lifelong cloud of speculation. At home, things weren't easier. Frank Sinatra Sr. was a titan, larger than life, adored everywhere, and often emotionally distant. When Frank Jr. later became his father's musical director, their relationship took on a business-like tone, blurring the line between family and duty. He spent decades performing, carving out a respectable career, yet the comparisons were inescapable. Frank Sinatra Jr. wasn't hidden or denied. His struggle was different, living a life defined by a famous father, a public trauma, and a shadow he could never fully outrun. Chaplin's late-life children. with Una O'Neill. Charlie Chaplin's later years looked peaceful from the outside, an aging legend living quietly in Switzerland with his young wife, Una O'Neill. But inside that household was a very different story. Chaplin was in his mid-50s when their first child was born, and 73 when their last arrived. In total, the couple had 8 children, each growing up under the extraordinary weight of a father who was both a global icon and an elderly parent. For the younger Chaplin children, life meant navigating a world where their father's greatest achievements had happened decades before they were born. They were surrounded by reminders of his legacy, fans who treated him like royalty, film scholars constantly visiting the home, and a public that viewed their father as something closer to a myth than a man. Balancing that legacy with normal childhood development proved difficult. Some thrived in the arts, and others pushed back against the pressure. One daughter famously left the family estate at 18, determined to escape the powerful shadow cast over her life. Others struggled with identity, mental health, or the challenge of forming careers separate from their father's towering reputation. These children weren't hidden scandals. They were acknowledged heirs to a legend. But living in the glow of that legend created its own quiet burden, one far more complicated than fame ever revealed. Hollywood's golden age sold perfection, perfect stars, perfect romances, perfect families. But the stories behind these 13 children reveal how fragile that illusion really was. Some were hidden to protect careers. Others were denied to preserve reputations. A few grew up believing lies that shaped their entire identities, and many carried the emotional fallout long after the headlines faded. In the end, these weren't scandals created for entertainment. They were real lives shaped by secrecy, shame, and decisions made inside an industry that valued image over honesty. The studios buried the truth to protect the stars, but the children paid the price. And if these stories slipped through the cracks, it makes you wonder how many more remain buried in Hollywood's past, or still waiting to surface.